This is the story about how I was almost kidnapped by a coworker. Who knows what he was planning? You tell me. When I was in high school, I worked at a family-owned plant nursery and garden store. At the time this took place, I was a cashier and had been working there for 2 to 3 years. It's important to note that while I went to high school, I also attended a vocational school. The students at this vocational school came from high schools all over the county, so it wasn't uncommon to have friends or know people from a few towns over. The place where I worked was the perfect spot for a teenager to get a job. There was a good mix of adult employees and teen employees, and it was a fantastic place to work. During the summer one year, a boy started working there. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Connor. I recognized him from the vocational school we attended. We got a bit friendly at work, but I would have never considered him a friend, just a coworker or acquaintance. To be honest, I always had an off feeling about him. His mannerisms and actions just made me uncomfortable, but I had no reason to be mean or dislike him because he never really gave me a reason to. It's hard to explain, but it was a gut feeling of some kind. Before I go any further, I want to give a little more context about my job. To get to work or home, I took the bus or got a ride from my dad. The bus stop was a 15-minute walk from my job, and the ride included a transfer at some point. If the buses were on time, it was a 25-minute commute. With rush hour and late or full buses, it could take 45 minutes or more. My dad usually only drove me to and from work on the weekends. After a few weeks and more interactions with Connor, I started to get the feeling that he liked me. Whatever register I was on, there were multiple throughout the store. He would frequently walk by and sometimes even stop to chat for a minute. I always maintained a friendly coworker vibe and did not do or say anything that might have made him feel differently. One day, he asked if I wanted a ride home. I found this odd because I didn't think he had a car, as I always saw him skateboard to work. I just declined and we went about our day. The next weekend, he asked again, and again I declined. I asked if he had a car and he said no, but he could ask to borrow a car from his parents and drive me home. I told him that wasn't necessary. I didn't mind taking the bus, and it just so happened that day my dad was picking me up. This exchange probably happened 5 or 6 more times. I've got to give it to him, the boy had some persistence. Every time I politely declined, but after the 3rd time it started to creep me out. In my high school teenage girl mind, I thought I was making it pretty clear that I wasn't interested in spending more time together. The last time he asked, I caved. He asked early in the morning. It just so happened that day it was planned that my dad was going to pick me up from work, but he had told me on the way to work that he wouldn't be able to. I can't remember why, but it had something to do with his girlfriend, I'm sure. Anyway, I was feeling pretty bummed about having to walk and take the bus. If I remember correctly, it was supposed to thunderstorm all day. Connor came up to me as I was opening my registers and said, "Hey, I finally got my own car." I was happy for him, as our conversations at work in recent weeks had been about his parents possibly bringing him car shopping soon. We talked about it and I congratulated him. Then he asked if I wanted a ride home that day. At this point, I was honestly fed up with him asking. I thought, what the hell, maybe if I say yes and let him drive me home this once, he'll stop asking. So I agreed. The day went on and eventually lunch rolled around. I took my break and went up to eat in the break room. When my break was almost over, another employee came up and started talking about how there were a couple of cop cars in the parking lot with their lights on, and 2 officers went into the admin office. The rest of this story is what I pieced together from what others told me. The local police occasionally made drive-bys of my place of employment. The owners had some family friends who were officers and they looked out for them. I guess on this day, that family friend cop did a drive-by and noticed a car in the parking lot that had been reported stolen that morning. He pulled over to investigate. I guess at this time when another officer pulled up, a backpack was spotted, very poorly hidden behind a nearby tree. They did some investigating, found some things along with an ID, and went into the admin office. The police officers told the owners what they found, and Connor was called in to speak with them. As it turns out, Connor had stolen his uncle's car that morning. The backpack that was found had his ID in it, along with rope, duct tape, and a switchblade. When he was called into the office, his uncle and parents were called. I guess the uncle said he didn't want to press charges, which is why Connor didn't leave with the police. The boss asked Connor to leave for the day and he did. I don't know if he was questioned about the contents of the backpack. And if he was, I don't know what his answers were or the reasoning was for having those things. No one knew that he was going to give me a ride home that day. I hadn't told anyone. It wasn't until after all this went down that I told my mom. I didn't mention this before, but my mom worked in the admin office. Connor didn't work there much longer after that. The whole thing creeped me out so badly that I made it a point to avoid running into him at the vocational school. I remember using humor as a coping mechanism for the whole weird thing. Oftentimes, my mom and I would joke around about the guy who was going to kidnap me. I only remember this now because 2 to 3 years ago, I was scrolling through Facebook when I came across a shared in memoriam post. I recognized the face, and when I clicked through the profile, it clicked where I knew this face from. It was Connor. I had blocked this kid and this clearly traumatizing experience out so well that I completely forgot about him. His name, that we worked together, and what happened. By this time, it had been 8 years. After some digging, I learned that he died from a drug overdose. On his profile, it listed previous places of employment, one being my old job. This made me message my mom. I texted her and said something along the lines of, "Do you remember Connor, last name?" She replied with, "Are you serious?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She followed with, "You mean the guy that was going to kidnap you?" That was all she had to say. I had a crazy flashback. I was so surprised and concerned that I could block something out like that. I'm clearly still trying to process it, as it's been 2 years since that conversation with my mom. But anyway, that is my creepy encounter. This happened back in August of 2013. I was camping in far north Queensland, Australia, in a place called Barron Falls, which is northwest of Cairns. I was a 21-year-old girl at the time and was camping with my 2 male friends who were backpacking from Estonia. I'll call them Theo and Charlie. Where we set up camp was not an official campsite. Instead, we walked along a tourist path, climbed over a railing, followed a train track for a few kilometers, and eventually veered off into the dense forest downhill to the river. It certainly wasn't easy to get to this area, and there wasn't any mobile phone service, but Theo knew about it from friends who had shown him previously. The sight was beautiful. We were surrounded by a tropical forest, and were only a short walk upstream from the waterfall. After setting up camp, we walked to the waterfall where both Theo and Charlie jumped from the cliff into the water below. I decided not to follow them. I was and still am scared of heights and the possibility of hurting myself. I sat and watched them for a while before eventually deciding to return to camp and read my book. I was totally relaxed. enjoying the serenity and taking in the beauty around me. What had been an exciting, adventurous day was then interrupted by a deep, sinister laugh coming from the forest surrounding our campsite. Instantly alerted, I felt chills run through my body as I scanned the forest, trying to detect where the laugh had come from. There was nothing. I tried to forget about it, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. Theo and Charlie returned and told me that they had forgotten firelighters for the campfire. They said they'd need to travel to the nearest store to buy some, and that I should wait at camp. I told them that I didn't feel comfortable staying at camp but didn't mention the laughter I'd heard before. I didn't want them to think I was being silly. For context, at the time I had quite a large crush on Charlie. Stupidly, I wanted him to think I was cool. They told me it would be fine and that they would be back before dark. Reluctantly, I agreed and let them go. It was about 4 p.m., and I continued reading my book. I began to think about it and realized that the walk back to the car was about 20 to 30 minutes, so they would be gone for well over an hour. At this time of year, dusk would be around 5:30 p.m. or so, and I would therefore likely be alone in this remote area in the dark. I distracted myself with my book, but as dusk began to settle, I struggled to read the pages and fear began to set in. After about an hour, I started to hear footsteps in the forest. My first thought was that Theo and Charlie had returned, and I was instantly relieved that I was no longer alone. I listened for their voices but heard nothing. My heart dropped. It dawned on me that it might not be them, and I started panicking. Then came the laughter. The same deep, sinister laugh I'd heard before. Only this time it seemed much closer. I jumped to my feet and scanned the forest. Then I saw him. He was standing on the other side of a stream connected to the river. Standing on a log, what I saw was absolutely bizarre. He was wearing an immaculate tuxedo with a top hat and all. I remember being puzzled as to how he was able to get to this area in such clean formal clothes. At first, I thought he might be an apparition or that I was hallucinating. I did a double take and I was not. I then studied the man's face. It is hard to describe, but he appeared to have suffered from severe burns and had a deep scarring covering his face. His hair was shoulder length, very wiry and unkempt. He laughed, that same laugh I'd heard from the forest. It came from him. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes. I had planned to sprint into the forest if he charged at me, and observed that the small creek between us would at least slow him down. He then asked, "What are you doing here all alone?" with an unsettling smile on his face. Luckily, I was able to remain calm and told him that I was camping with my male friends and that they went to get some supplies but would be back soon. The man laughed again. He asked me how long we would be there. I lied and said we were leaving the next day. It seemed as if this man wanted to provoke a reaction out of me, that he wanted me to panic and run, and that he wanted to chase me. I remained calm and acted as if we were having a standard conversation. I think this confused him. Miraculously, I heard Theo and Charlie's voices approaching. The man seemed alarmed and said that he saw somebody else camping upstream, and that he was going to check on them. He left, and minutes later, Theo and Charlie returned. I immediately told them what happened, and they laughed, thinking I was making it up as a lame attempt to scare them. Tears began to gather in my eyes, and Charlie realized that I was serious. Theo didn't seem fazed. He was a very stereotypical backpacker and had the carefree nature that travelers tend to have. Charlie, however, assured me that I would be okay, and had me sleep between him and Theo for the next 2 nights. I barely slept at all during those nights. I kept listening for the laughter, but fortunately I never heard it again. For years after, I searched online for any reports of similar encounters. I never found anything, but I have always contemplated what would have happened if Theo and Charlie hadn't returned at that moment. I shudder at the thought. I would love to hear what you guys think this man's intentions were and if I was right to be terrified. I haven't been camping since. One evening, I was out in Lacey, Washington to pick up a handgun I had recently purchased for protection. Even though the online status and an email told me it was ready for pickup, the store didn't have it in stock yet. They told me to come back in another week. I lived about an hour from Lacey at the time, and when I arrived, the evening rush hour was just starting to become unbearable. I didn't want to drive all the way back home just yet, as it would add an additional hour to my already long commute. Side note, the car I was driving belonged to my dad. I was borrowing it until I had enough money saved up for a new car after my beloved Honda broke down the previous year. I killed some time wandering around the store where I had purchased my firearm. Then I decided to drive over to the nearest coffee shop. It was a newly built, cabin-style cafe with a modern twist. The barista handed me my 16-ounce dirty chai, and I walked back out to my car. I then drove to a gas station around the corner, still trying to kill time until traffic thinned out. The car didn't need gas, so I pulled into a parking spot right at the corner of the four-way street block where the gas station was located. I turned off the engine, stepped outside, and lit up a cigarette, leaning against the driver's side door to avoid stinking up the interior. The weather was overcast and drizzly, but not overly cold. It was now dusk, and most daylight had disappeared. The stoplights at the intersection were diffused by the late autumn mist. I watched them flicker from green to yellow to red and back again as the traffic moved accordingly. Zoned out by the lights and lost in thought while enjoying my coffee and smoke, I didn't notice the man walking toward me until he was already halfway across the street. He was white, of average height, and had strawberry blonde hair. He looked to be in his mid-20s. It was clear he hadn't changed his clothes in a good while, and he carried a backpack which I assumed held the few belongings he had. He didn't smell, but he looked raggedy and unkempt. My immediate thought was that drugs were likely part of his lifestyle. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I'm always cautious having grown up in the suburbs of Seattle. The man finished crossing the street and awkwardly limped toward my car, maintaining eye contact and giving a winced grin. I locked my car out of caution but remained outside, smoking casually. Normally, I'm not a social person, but I don't go out of my way to be unpleasant either. He approached me and stood about 10 feet away when he said hello and asked if I had a light. I hesitated, but saw no harm in meeting his simple request. Taking 2 steps forward, I lit his cigarette, which he was holding out toward me. As he approached, he attempted to make small talk, weaving in hints that he had just gotten off the bus and still needed to get down the road another block. Somewhere in his poorly crafted sob story, he stopped himself mid-sentence like a bad actor and pretended to be struck by an epiphany. "Hey, would you mind just dropping me off down the road? It's not very far." I apologized and said I couldn't help because it was my dad's car, not my own, and I didn't feel comfortable without my father's permission. Some stupid yet plausible excuse I came up with on the spot. Mr. Unkempt did not like my answer. His smile immediately turned tense and flat. Clearly upset, he became more insistent. "But it's just down the road," he whined. "My leg is killing me and it wouldn't even be far for you. I'll give you a cigarette." His persistence and sudden burst of hostility made my hair stand on end. I firmly said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't help you. It's my dad's car and he has set rules." Absolute nonsense. With 10 years of hospitality under my belt, I immediately offered him alternative ideas of what he could do to get where he needed to be. I even suggested that maybe someone in the gas station could help him out or call him a ride. Each word I said made him increasingly irate, and he began curling his fingers into fists, not in a threatening way, but like a toddler about to scream bloody murder for not getting their way. He seemed to pause and size me up for a fleeting moment. I'm small and not at all intimidating physically, so I told him I hoped he made it home safe. Then I quickly unlocked my car, jumped in, and locked myself inside. When I looked up from locking the car door, I saw him speed walking back across the street from the direction he originally came from. No limp, no awkward walk whatsoever, no distress or pain showing at all. Just a normal speed walk of a physically well person, a rageful person. I knew I had dodged a bullet, and I felt pretty dumb for hanging around the city after dark alone. At that point, I didn't care about traffic anymore, so I started the engine and hightailed it home. It ended up being an hour and 45-minute drive, but this time the traffic was 100% worth the inconvenience. Public service announcement. If you haven't heard it enough already, be careful who you give your attention to, especially when you're alone. Always stay aware and err on the side of caution, even when strangers seem harmless at first. Crazy, bad-acting hitchhiker guy. I hope you got the help you needed rather than the help you wanted, and I hope we never meet again.